There we go. And so welcome to our 6th week of the Reinvention of Work. And I wanted to have us begin, again, just welcoming someone I consider a very valued mentor and dear friend for well over 20 years, Reverend Matthew Fox. Doesn't really need an introduction with all of you. This is a one of your many fan clubs, Matt, and we have been really enjoying going through the Reinvention of Work chapter by chapter over the last 6 weeks, and are just so pleased to have you with us. When I wrote Matt a couple of weeks ago saying, what do you want to talk about? And I asked, you wrote the book almost 30 years ago, and we're finding it so pertinent today, but I'm wondering, as you look back on and its writing and bringing it forth and referring back to it, what's been arising for you on that topic? We can start there.
Okay, well, first of all, again, I want to thank Deidre for not just this course, but for her life's work and the way she's helping people to reinvent their work. And that's so important at this time, because I think all our work roles are stuck in the modern consciousness, but we're not there anymore. I mean, hopefully we're moving beyond that. And I would identify the modern consciousness as, among other things, being very human-centered. Pope Francis uses the term narcissistic for our species. And it shows in the issues of climate change. It shows in the issues that have come up already in terms of indigenous wisdom and people and genocide and all that. And as if it's not just that we're human-centered, but we're our tribe-centered. And so for me, a big part of work, and of course I emphasize how work is our footprint that we leave behind. I mean, that and our children, but so much of our effort as adults is in preparing for work, and we call that education or apprenticeship or whatever you, and working, and then recovering from work, and maybe raising a family, and that's kind of it. And so work is so big a part of our souls. Are we putting our souls into work? And so I think one of the main points that I still love about my book is the question of what joy does our work bring us, and what joy does our work bring others? First of all, that's not a modern question. Joy was not issue number one on the climbing of the ladder in industrial work of the 18th and 19th century and so forth. But it should be. I love that statement from the Tao Te Ching, in work, do what you enjoy. And then I found this echo. One of the big parts about my book is that it's deeply ecumenical. That is to say, I drew from the mystical traditions of the world, because I was really struck by how much all the world religions have to say about work, and how very little of it is being practiced, if you will, in the modern version of work, where work becomes, for the most part, a job and a way to make a living. But the deeper questions of the footprint we're leaving for future generations, for example, have not been sufficiently addressed. But it begins with joy, I think. And that's the via positiva, of course. That's where all spirituality begins, joy and wonder. And I love that Rumi poem that you just read, because the idea that the worker, the craftsperson as he uses it, is attracted by what isn't there. And so really that's what we all have to be asking today, what's missing in our profession? Like this past week, and I think you shared this with this group, I'm not real sure, Deidre, but Peter well, a lawyer friend of mine, forget his name right now, he wrote about this whole issue of originalism, which is the favorite philosophy of 5 conservatives on the Supreme Court, even though it wasn't even taught in law schools in his day, Peter Gabel. And so I really like his work because he's criticizing his own profession and he's taking a hard look at it. And I'm not a lawyer, but I'm pretty fed up with lawyers, I'll tell you that, and with judges. And they pull these things out of their hats and they live, many of them live these lives that seem to be beyond the, well, one example is this document that's just come out, leaked out. It's supposed to be about pregnancy and so forth, but women are nowhere to be seen in the document except from this 17th century fellow who was busy burning women witches. And he's being quoted in a Supreme Court document in 2022 as a positive source. So I just think like our law schools need a whole lot of nothingness. They need to be emptied of a lot of stuff. And but that's true of religion, and it's true of education itself, and it's true of economics and business. I just think we're in this state where humanity has to grow from being adolescent, which we've been for long enough, to being adult. And the way we do and redo work is at the heart of that growth. And you know, there are these efforts, of course, some business people are trying to raise the ethical and moral questions about ecology and what we're leaving for generations to come behind us and so forth. But it can't happen fast enough because time's running out for all of us, because it's running out for the earth as we know her and for the many other species besides ourselves who are undergoing struggle. So when I look at this book, a few years ago, I ran into a business person, interesting guy. He was a sports person, and he had a very popular radio program about fishing and stuff like that. But then he also sold items for things like fishing and other sports that people engage in. And but he is a businessman primarily, and he fell in love with my book. He wrote a letter and said this book should be in every business class in America because it's raising the real questions, he said. But unfortunately, he died just a couple of years after I met him, quite young. I think he was about 50 or so. But I was struck by that this particular businessman got it, that it's time to bring values into our work worlds again. And of course, Anita Roddick is another fine example of that in my life. We crossed paths in many positive ways. She supported a university and so forth, and I would speak I spoke in her workplace and so forth. And so she was a pioneer in this regard too. But just in the past week, three events have come to mind for me. Actually 4, because I just mentioned this lawyer who's busy reinventing his work world, which really needs reinvention. But Susie Goblick died. Now, I don't know how many of you know Susie Goblick. She actually was on our faculty. She taught a course of artist meditation on making altars to the Black Madonna. In fact, I have her picture of her altars right here. Maybe I'll show it to you. But she was an artist and grew up in New York as an artist, and she attended art schools and so forth. But after a while, she really woke up and she said, you know, we need a new kind of art. We need an art that has a morality to it and an ethics to it and a project to it. It's not just about everybody's ego. And she was quoting, she wrote this wonderful book called The Re-Enchantment of Art. Now, I highly recommend it, Re-Enchantment of Art. It's not long, but she was a brave woman because she left her advantages as an accomplished artist and art teacher an art critic in New York City and turned her back on that whole art world, which, as she says, was modern. And she quotes in her book a lot of artists of the 20th century said, don't bother me with morality, don't bother me with the community, I'm just doing my thing, kind of a thing. And she said, we have a common project now, and it is saving the earth. So artists have to get on board. And so she gave up a career, really, to critique art in our time. And again, the title of the book says a lot, the Re-Enchantment of Art. I think we could be talking about the re-enchantment of law, and the re-enchantment of education, and the re-enchantment of religion. And so she's someone who came into my world again the last few days because she died, and several people wrote me about that who were students or co-teachers with me at Art University. Another person who came in my mind again, and I think this is all synchronicity in light of this being with you in this class, was just yesterday morning. I listened in on a lecture going on in Vienna, Austria. It was 7 p.m. there, and it was 10 a.m. here, by a friend of mine who actually taught in our course school too, Robert Kramer, who is an expert on Otto Rank, the psychologist who was with Freud at the beginning of Freud's efforts and was the youngest one in his circle, and everyone agreed the brightest one, and Freud was closest to him. But they split. Freud and he had a conflict, and the conflict was over the feminine, because Freud emphasized so much the father and then the Oedipal complex. And Freud asked the question, what do women want? And never answered it. But as this lecturer, Robert Kramer, my friend, who's living in Hungary now, Budapest, a professor in Budapest, but he's American. He said, Rank says what women want is to be women. And I add, yeah, and to be human beings and be treated like them. But Freud never answered his question, but Rank did. And Rank very much supported the artist. So he had to move because the Freudians excommunicated him and denounced him because he broke with Freud. And he moved from Vienna to Paris. And there in the 30s, he worked with artists like Anais Nin, who actually wrote the preface to his wonderful book, Art and Artist, and Henry Miller, and Salvador Dali. I did not know this. Salvador Dali loved Otto Rank because Otto Rank was dealing with the future. When this fellow who's assigned, who we just spoke with, who's the futuristic science fiction, you might derive something from that relationship too. And the lecturer yesterday was lecturing from Sigmund Freud's office, where in fact, Otto Rank and Sigmund Freud had their final goodbye, and they never talked again, although they corresponded after that. But Freud really excommunicated Otto Rank. But Otto Rank is very important to me, and he is, I think, to Chris Petrov, because he builds this whole psychology around creativity. And his last book was called Beyond Psychology. And so if that's not reinventing work, I don't know what is. So like this previous woman, Susie Goblik, he paid a price, Otto Rank did, for reinventing his work, going beyond psychology. And of course, he died in 1939, died quite young. But he dared to stand up to Freud, and psychology in his day was Freud. And he critiqued it, especially and the lecturer last night, he had a big point that Freud had a terrible relationship with his mother. And he was afraid to look at his mother. His mother lived to be in her 95 or so. But that he never really, even Freudians don't know anything about Freud's mother hardly, except she was a strong personality. But so anyway, there I was for 2 hours listening to this lecture live on Zoom from Freud's office, which was quite anti-Freudian because it was telling the story about Otto Rank. But another story about a person who dared to reinvent his work, paid a terrible price. The Freudians, the people around Freud, they so denounced Radharani, they went to his publisher, Knopf in New York, and said, if you publish anything more by Radharani, you'll never get anything more from Sigmund Freud. But Radharani, as the fellow pointed out, was successful in America, especially when it came to social justice. And there's a whole social school in Pennsylvania that's based on Radharani's work. So Radharani was very keen on women's liberation. He died in 1939, and on social justice. And his first chapter in this book, Beyond Psychology, which was published after he died, is on Karl Marx. And he asks the question, why is Marx so popular, so important in the 20th century? And he answers it, because he offers hope to the poor, to the poorest of the poor. And hope is something irrational. And Radharani says, our society thinks it's rational. Of course, he means our patriarchal society pretends it's rational. But underneath, he said, life itself is irrational. And women are more aware of that, and children are more aware of that. And he tells women, don't follow this psychology today, create your own psychology. This current psychology, which I would call patriarchal, Freudian, he says it's now man's last attempt to control nature, this time his own. So a tremendous critique that is still so alive. And Radharani became the father, the intellectual father to the humanist psychology school. Rollo May and Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers said, Radharani is my mentor. And Maslow, they all stand on the shoulders of Rank, but Rank's never been given any credit. And the fellow said last night, he's not taught in any psychology school in the world is Radharani taught. Well, he was taught in our school, though, in our Grace Spirituality school, because I caught on early to what he was doing. So again, I'm just pointing out that events in my life this past week have brought me to this moment of meeting with you around work. One more example is my brother, Tom. He's 84 now. He lives in Iceland. His wife is Icelandic and an artist, but they lived in Chicago for many years, and she attended the Art Institute in Chicago. And but he's retired in Iceland now. That was their agreement. He's also learning Icelandic at 84, which is not easy to do, but he's doing it. But anyway, his whole life has been about reinventing education. He gave me a manuscript a few weeks ago that he's done about moving from education, the way we spell it, to education, E-D-G-E, education. And the many experiments he did with children about how much children can learn if they're allowed the freedom to do it. And he did a lot of experiments. For example, he would have his kids, these are 5th and 6th graders, 10 and 11-year-old or something, creating Sharp Cathedral, for example, even though it's public school, in the classroom. So one group would learn about buttresses, and one would learn about stained glass and so forth. And then put it all together, and he'd have them creating Greek plays and so forth, and skeletons to study the human body and so forth. So he brought action into learning, not exams. And what came out of the kids was so energetic and so alive and so forth. It had a lot to do with my intuitions about art as meditation too. But the fact that I read his entire manuscript the last week and got back to him about it, again, all this synchronicity of being with you today. And regarding my own experience, of course, my work has really been in two fields. One is religion, and I've tried to move that from religion to spirituality. It is a paradigm shift, or if you will, from original sin to original blessing, which was such a paradigm shift that the Vatican noticed and it blew the roof off 2 papacies. Not this one. Pope Francis is borrowing our ideas in his encyclical on the environment, but the previous popes called my work, quote, it's a quote, dangerous and deviant, unquote. So part of the reinventing work is you're going to make a few enemies, you're going to step on a few toes. So one of the first things is, make your skin thick skin, necessary part of doing any of this stuff. And then the other half of my work has been education, because I figured out real early in my young 30s that you can't teach spirituality in a modern European style educational system, because it's so rational. It's all about the left brain. And spirituality is about the heart and the body and all the chakras, including those chakras with which we dance, the lower chakras. And so there are so many ways that humans learn. Ritual and dancing, for example, is a very important way of learning. And so that's why I brought in circle dancing in our Great Spirituality University, as well as art as meditation, because as Hildegard says, wisdom is found in all creative works. So again, this is a paradigm shift from knowledge to wisdom. And one dimension of that is bringing the feminine in. Wisdom is feminine around the world. That's why she was evicted from education 500 years ago, when patriarchy really took over with a vengeance. And we have to bring the balance back. Knowledge is useful, but it's got to be in a larger picture of wisdom. And so that's part of that paradigm shift. So there's a few thoughts about what I'm still thinking about. But let me close my little thing there with 2 pages from this book that I really love. One is Eckhart's statement, because it yanks us out of that anthropocentrism that has dominated modern consciousness, including education in the modern era. Says Eckhart on page 58, the outward work can never be small if the inward work is great. And the outward work can never be great or good if the inward is small or of little worth. The inward work always includes in itself all size, all breadth, and all length. It's so important that we have the inner work and the outer work. The inner work serving the outer work, and the outer work also coming home to the inner work and bringing questions and the rest with it, and energy. But to realize how big the inner work is, the inner work is cosmic in size. And that's a relief to know that all breadth, all length, all size is included in our inner work. And that inner work includes joy, it includes grief, it includes silence, it includes creativity, and it includes action for justice and healing and celebration and compassion. So, and then the goal is to mix the inner and the outer work, and to bring that inner work, that energy, into everything we do. Like that love of life. Audre Lorde, the poet, African-American poet, she says that I am erotic when I bake bread, when I make a table, when I write poetry, or when I make love. That eros is passion for living. And according to the Book of Wisdom in the Hebrew Bible, it says, quote, this is wisdom to love life. So wisdom is eros. And of course, under patriarchy, eros has become a bad word. It's a naughty word. We turn it over to pornographers. That's how far we've come from a passion for living and from realizing the virtue that being in love with life is all about. It's a virtue. And it should be present in all of our learning and in all of our doing, all of our working. That love of life shows through. And to me, that's part of the paradigm shift. And again, it's a shift from patriarchal mindset to indigenous and feminine mindset. And remembering one definition of indigenous religion is that indigenous religion is Aboriginal mother love. Aboriginal mother love. That's from the book Beyond Geography, a really powerful book on the history of America from the point of view of the Native American the day Columbus landed. It's quite a different take on American history that we've gotten. But just that one definition is powerful. Aboriginal mother love. That's what's gotten us this far. And it's not about dethroning the masculine, but it is about reforming the masculine, because a patriarchal version of masculinity is toxic. It's sick. We can see it everywhere. And it's not healthy. It's not healthy masculine. A healthy masculine wants to unite Father Sky and Mother Earth, cosmos and Earth, and our own psyches. So those are a few thoughts. One more page I had marked was 128, which I love a lot, and where E.F. Schumacher says that we can all be busy putting our inner houses in order. That's the primary work of our generation, to put our inner houses in order. True, because we project our inner onto the outer. And if the inner is not dynamic and cosmic, which means bigger than just our worlds of work worlds and our nationhoods and all the other silos we find ourselves in, then we're not going to be bringing new energy and rebirth to our work worlds. So let me stop there with that question.
Yum. I have lots of questions, but does anyone have a burning question as you've been listening? And those who haven't introduced yourselves yet to Matt, I would love for him to get to know you as well. So anybody, any Mary Beth?
I'll say something. I just, I graduated, and I think it was 2004. I'm not sure, 2, 3, 4. Well, anyway, in 2005, I began the diamond approach with Hamid Ali, and I have been doing the inner work that you just spoke of. Unless there's radiant beauty inside, I mean, whatever's in is what shines out. And so just taking a really deep dive the last 15 years, very, blessed to be able to do that. I worked at the VA with our veterans and was able to retire and had the luxury of doing some of that work. So very, very grateful. But I'm in a process now of, I'm just 68 years old. I figure I've got 20, maybe 30 more years, like another whole lifetime. So I'm here with Deidre and the group to just explore, like, how can I best, love and support the world? But my major focus is with the ecology. And as you said, Matt, at the very beginning, we're in a self-destructive mode with the climate. So is there anything in particular that you see as a focus that individuals can, I know our governments and our politics run so much of our environment, but any thoughts on the environment?
Well, I think it's wonderful that you're looking at this phase of your life as an important vocation in itself. The whole role of eldership is so underdeveloped in Western culture, not among Indigenous peoples, but it's a distortion. When the message, what are the messages that we give elders in our country, in our culture? Very often it's about that retirement, means you spend the rest of your life on a golf course or playing the stock market or something if you have that kind of resources. But I talk about refirement, and that it is a time when you no longer have to work for a particular organization and so forth. It's really the time to ask the big question that you're asking. And that's when I'm glad that you're asking the question, about what do I have to give now? What is the fire in my belly now? And I think most often it has to do with the youngest generation. And of course, that's what the environment is all about, isn't it? What are we handing on to the youngest generation? As you know, there are young couples today who are choosing not to have children because it looks so bleak to them. And it's a very serious question that young couples are asking. So how can we link up with the wisdom of the young? And I think it begins with listening, that this is a generation that is facing something so vast, that is climate change and so forth, that no other generation has faced something so vast. Many generations have faced real problems and issues, but something as vast as this. And so we need to team up to help one another not only get through this, but to make it count. One example is this. I was at my sister's husband's memorial service just a month ago, and one of our, my niece's sons, so it'd be my great nephew, is living in Germany. He's half German and half American. His father's German. And he's 17 years old, and he's an absolutely committed vegan. And I mean, really serious about it. He won't even wear or sit on anything that's leather or wool. Right? Very, very serious about it. But at the same time, I met a couple of years ago a scientist who had concluded that if everyone on the planet turned vegan, we could stop climate change in 10 years and reverse it if we turned all the livestock land that we are now using for livestock into trees, which it was originally. That's how powerful our diets are. Now, I don't conclude from that everyone has to be vegan, but there's a spectrum of veganism. There's vegetarianism, which is one step down, if you will, from vegan. And then, of course, there's fasting, and there's abstinence, and there's eating a lot less meat and so forth than we often do. But the point is that it's amazing. And the scientist who said that, he said, I'm an engineer, and I know my numbers. And what I'm telling you is absolutely true. We could not just stop climate change, but reverse it. That's how much power humans have in terms of decisions we make. So for me as an elder, I'm 81, to hear this 17-year-old grandnephew tell me his life is now devoted to veganism, that's just really interesting. And here I am at my age, sharing this information to an older group from a 17-year-old practice, his practice. He's not just talking about it. He's been practicing it for 3 years in a serious way. So, there's, when I talk about intergenerational wisdom, that I think a lot of young people are asking what they can do. And some are, of course, freaking out. The rising teenage suicides and so forth, and depression and all the rest. Of course, a lot of it is due to the coronavirus too, and being away from their peers and all this for 2 years. There's just a lot going on with young people today. So I would ask the universe and how you can work with young people. What are they asking of you today? And then start talking to some. I've often recommended that we should put up an ad on Facebook or something, someplace where young people are, and say, you want to get together in a circle with older people, no agenda, to mix the generations, you see. And tell the young people, we're here to listen, first of all. Of course, we'll have something to say. We always do. We've got our stories to share. But to bring forward, to get more consciously calling for circles of young and old, and bring forth some common wisdom out there. I think that's very important. Of course, ritual is another way to bring young and old together. And our Order of the Sacred Earth is an effort at that too. Our leaders are in their young 30s, and but also creative rituals, because in ritual, it's not a competition. And some rituals become so boring, there's only in the hands of a few people. But the real meaning of ritual is to come together and to celebrate and to grieve and to empower. And we can all do that. Certainly, we've been trying to do that with our Cosmic Mass for 25 years, and we've had some powerful experiences there.
Well, thank you. Just the idea of bringing the youth in. like I said, I don't have children, and my partner's older, and she retired from the Forest Service, and is a silviculturist in the trees, and she knows what's happening. We both know what's happening in Northern California. We are one match away from total destruction.
Mm.
So at least, that I am in contact with young people a little bit. So thank you. I think that's an avenue to explore. And I think we're ready to listen to each other up here
That's
in
great.
the Mount Shasta area. So thank you.
Oh, yeah. And I bet your partner would have wonderful stories to tell about.
Yeah, how things used to be, and you can just see the beauty and how life force is being sucked from us from the lack of oxygen and the chemicals in the air, and it's just so what used to be a pristine, beautiful part of the planet is in such a drought that the water is stagnant. And I think just to tell the stories to the children that it used to not be this way. So I love that intergenerational connection. So thank you.
Intergenerational wisdom. Yeah.
Wisdom, yes.
Mhm.
Lynn put something in the chat about a millennial, a Canadian millennial, Generation Dread, Finding Purpose in an Age of Climate Crisis by Britt, W-R-A-Y. So young voice to listen to. Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks, Lynn. Thank you.
Thank you.
Roxanne.
Yeah.
I see CJ is raising her hand as well.
Yeah, hi. It's so nice to meet you, Matthew. I'm here in Oakland also. I'm an English major and longtime book lover, and also a longtime Sufi. So I found you by your books on the mystics.
Uh-huh.
And I came to this class in that way. And this section on work is really catching me at an interesting time. I got laid off in the pandemic, and I decided to turn it into an opportunity to start my coaching business to coach young people to have meaningful work and meaningful careers, to get that first job that they want or that first type of work. And so now what I'm sitting with right now, because I'm just starting this, and my first client number one, she's just starting to get interviews for jobs that she's interested in, and she wants to work in the green field. It has to be environmental. That is the only thing that motivates her, and I feel like so many of them are like this. But I worry that the American workplace is kind of not good enough for them. I want to encourage them to find meaningful work and make meaningful work and do meaningful work, but I've been out there in the workplace myself, and I know what it's like. So I'm trying to balance how much of it is get a job, pay your student loans, pay rent, and how much of it is do the great work, dig in there, and do what is in your heart. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like you're right at the cutting edge there. I wish you well. I'm glad you're with the young and trying to coach them that way. And a lot of it is intuition and imagination, isn't it? And seeing where the where like Rilke was talking about, where the holes are. Like he says, a carpenter walks by a house and sees no door. Oh, he knows what his work is. So, if you can help these young people to fill in those empty places that are not appropriately present in the current work world, then something important is happening. And like you say, a lot of them have this value system in their hearts and minds, but sometimes there's a rude awakening when you go into the job market, but help them to keep that fire alive of their values and know the difference between a job and work. That we need jobs to pay our bills and all that, keep a roof over our heads, and as you say, to pay the student loans. But at the same time, maybe they're being called to something else as well. And you can learn things in a job world that can transfer and be useful in a greater work world too. Yeah. Well, one lesson I might want to share with you from the previous question, because about retirement is this, and I'll be brief, but a woman scientist a few years ago set out to answer this question. Why did Neanderthals disappear and Homo sapiens didn't? And of course, the previous opinion was that, well, we beat them all up in wars and we were tougher or something. But the truth is now we've learned that there's a lot of Neanderthal DNA in most of us. So we weren't just making war, we were making love as well. So that doesn't quite answer the question. And then what she found is this, that your average Neanderthal died around 40 or 41 years old. They didn't have grandparents, whereas your average Homo sapiens had 3 generations that we lived on into our late 50s or so forth. Now, I just think that's really significant for this whole issue of retirement or of elders. And I think this is why elders are honored in Indigenous tribes all over the world, because I think the memory is there. That without the grandparents, we wouldn't have made it. And now they've uncovered, we knew about Neanderthal because many of them are in Europe, but then the denizens, and now they've uncovered 14 other hominid tribes in Southeast Asia. And they're uncovering more all the time. So we have all these cousins we didn't know about until now. And yet the bottom line is they are all extinct. Only Homo sapiens is still standing. And look how close we are to going extinct. So for me, this is really, really rattles the cage. It really does, about many things, about the importance of facing our own extinction, that this is a real possibility. Scientists say we have 7 years left to change things, but also to realize the importance of elders. And this is important for elders to know as for young people to know, that our survival has happened because there were elders. And there are 3 generations. And it takes that much apparently for humans to get their act together. And so we should not only honor that, but be busy about making that happen more explicitly. How do we bring together the wisdom of the youngest and the oldest? The ones in the middle, the parents, they're too busy surviving. I mean, they're running the culture and they're trying to put food on the table and raise the kids in one way or another. But the role of the elders cannot be underestimated at this time. But elders have to get out of their couches and quit talking about how uncomfortable our bodies are or something, and start being generous again, and going the way that some of your questions are going. What can we do to make a difference? We can do a lot. We're essential. And no matter what our culture has lied to us about in trying to diminish us, because capitalism is only interested in those who are busy shopping.
Well, well said. I want to point out that on this call, we have multiple refired elders that are doing very work as you're describing. I don't know if Judy and Sally, Patricia, I know might want to
Mary
share.
here is raising her hand.
Mary and
Summers.
Jerry.
Yeah, I've got to pop off to talk to for a little second to help with younger people. So first I want to thank you. I can't believe I'm on the same call. I read your book in 1985 when I was pregnant with my first daughter, and stayed with reading. I'm a midwife here in Chicago. I run the only birth center in a community health center, 1 in 5 in the nation. I trained doulas and midwives and trying to grow and birth justice, more midwives of color that have been eliminated by our system of patriarchy and injustice. And I've worked at End of Life too, and I'm hoping to do a compassionate center here in Chicago, because there's no shortage of ways to be compassionate, and I think that's really needed in the world. But anyway, I got to hop off for just a little bit because I do have this training that I committed to before, but I've got someone subbing and they'll hop back on. But I want to say thank you so much, and thank you for this time.
Well,
I
thank
do
you.
have one
for the
comment to
wonderful
make.
work you're doing. Yeah. Good.
I do think with the young people, even when we think of, and I get your daily stuff of choice, like one of the saddest things, I've been a midwife now going on almost 40 years, that it's the first generation that it isn't so much they're not having kids because of choice, it's because they literally don't think they have a choice.
Mm.
That having children now becomes a luxury, and it is.
They can't
I could go
afford
on
it.
and on. They can't afford it, and there's many ways that the wealthy can afford it in all these different ways. And so it's a very change when we think about it. And I wouldn't want to be a young person right now, but I'm in the thick of young people, and I'm from a large family, so I've got gazillion nieces and nephews, and I don't have a shortage of young people to mentor. But it is a different twist than what we think of our own generation as they're looking at it. It's a way more cynical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's sad, but cynical, that's quite a word to use. I do have a quick story about Chicago and midwives. When I was teaching at Barra College, which is north of Chicago, one of my students was an African-American, and she invited me to her home for dinner, and it was in South Chicago. And we're eating there, several people at her dining room table, and she says, "This is where I had my child." I said, "Where?" She said, "On this table." She said, some relatives was a midwife, and we had my child right here on this table. So you reference the Black community and so forth in the role of midwives in Chicago. So there you go. This would have been back in the early 70s that I had dinner at her home.
Yeah.
On her
Yeah, Chicago has a long history of out of hospital and home birth and in the Black community, and then that kind of got taken away, and now we're bringing it back in. So
I'm
yeah.
glad to bring it back. Good for you.
Mary, thank you so much for your great work. And then I'm glad you were able to get here. So those of you who don't know, Mary's been teaching midwifery on Thursday evenings and sneaking in when she can. So so appreciative of the important work you're doing.
And I'll be back in too, so ignore me for a little.
Good. Oh, Robert, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, thank you, Deidre. Hey, Matthew, great to be with you.
Hello.
How are you?
Good, thank you.
Yeah, so just to introduce myself, I'm over here in the East Coast, near New York City and New Jersey. Been in a couple of your different programs, Mystics and Prophets and Thomas Aquinas, and read a ton of your books. I'm going through Christian Mystics, getting started here. And in your kind of intro here, you shared your reasoning for the book, and I'd like to read it. And you wrote, "I dedicate this book to the young. They deserve and require a healthier version of religion, one that celebrates the depths of mysticism, the love of the earth and the body, and a fierce commitment to community, compassion, and celebrated rituals, and justice making. They deserve a religion that is both simpler and more open to wisdom from all the world's spiritual traditions. May the mystics and meditations in these pages assist us all in reawakening the depths of our faith traditions, whatever they may be. May we travel lighter but stronger into a future worthy of our nobility as a species and worthy of the beauty of this wounded planet." And I felt called to share that because I felt really touched my whole life as a child. I always, my family was Catholic. I have a great aunt who was a Dominican, and my great uncle was a Monsignor. And I always just felt like there was something missing. And for the last 6 years, I've had a coaching company where I help career professionals and entrepreneurs essentially find their calling that they're here for and their purpose, and to navigate it. And what I've learned in my experience is that so much of finding our calling connects us back to our inner child, and connecting us back to the young one in us. And I'm curious if you have any wisdom or perspective from any of the mystics or historical traditions on how we can help our youth connect to their purpose more deeply, to really navigate their calling. So I'd love to just invite that question in if you have any thoughts or shares or perspective there.
Well, again, thank you very much for the work you're doing and the study you're doing, to support your work. That's just great news. And again, someone working with the young people. remember that mysticism itself is, I think, recovering the child inside.
Yeah.
It's about seeing the world as awesome and full of surprises and beautiful. And of course, Jesus talked a lot about that too, didn't he? That adults, he said, you adults have to become like children if you're going to receive the kingdom. And just all those words in there, the word receive, that, and that's what the Via Positiva is about, really. It's about receiving the grace of existence. And I do think the new cosmology really helps with that, to realize that we're receiving the ancestral light of 13.8 billion years. And any day now, of course, this new telescope, Webb telescope, is going to be beaming into our living rooms the original light at the beginning of the universe. I mean, it's just stunning. Ordinarily, when we talk about light, we're thinking about the sunlight. But the sun's only 5 billion years old. No, this is new light. This is the light. And even the Bible, even Genesis 1 makes a distinction between the sun and the light that began the world. But that is certainly today's great story from science. So I think to get young people back to awe and wonder is absolutely essential. And it's more doable, I think, when you bring science on board. Like when I worked in this Yale program, we created this inner city program for teenagers, inner city teenagers, because at the time, 64% of Black boys were not graduating from high school. And I said to myself, are they dumb or is education dumb? And of course, I learned real quick, which it was, the answer was, but I suspected it long before that. But the point is that what we were able to do to have these kids make movies and poetry and rap and so forth was to bring out of them their own wisdom and their own joy and their humor. I mean, it's true that this generation is facing awful things and there is a certain cynicism there, but there's resiliency there. There's humor. I can't be around young people and not hear laughter. And they know how to have fun. At least that's my experience. They know how to have fun. And so there's this, it's not just them, it's our nature as human beings that to survive, we need to laugh. And we know how to laugh, even in dire circumstances. And of course, we know how to give birth, our creativity. So here's just one example. At the end of the semester, we would invite about 150 adults to come. Some of them the parents and relatives, but other adults. And the kids would stand up and talk about their movie and then show it and then take questions. And afterwards, Mel Bricker, who may even be with us today, because I invited him to come and see this, he came up to me and he said, Matt, I'm so moved, I can't talk. I'll call you back in 48 hours. That's what I felt too. There's so much beauty in young people, but school doesn't invite it out. Education is no longer about educing. It's about stuffing questions and answers and tests into people. We have to get back to this unleashing of the wonder and the awe and the openness to beauty. You know, Rachel Carson's last book was about wonder. And in it, she says that, I believe she said that wonder is beaten out of our children today by the age of 16. Now she wrote it, I think, in 1964 or something like that. She died shortly after that book. And, but I found, actually, she died before it was printed. I have it right here, actually. There it is. The Sense of Wonder with photograph. But she wrote the text, but it wasn't put together with all the pictures until after she died. So it came out posthumously. But I was once reciting that statement from Rachel Carson in a lecture, and a woman spoke up. She said, I'm a kindergarten teacher. And that may have been in the 60s that 15-year-olds had lost wonder. But my experience is that 5-year-olds have lost wonder. I spend 95% of my time trying to bring wonder alive again in 5-year-olds. And so this loss of wonder and awe. But this is again where science can help. Something like this new telescope, but so many other instances that a cosmology is alive and among us again. And it is our job to bring people there. And, Thomas Berry says that when we lose a sense of the sacred, the only way to bring it back is to bring the cosmos back as the primary source of the sacred, and what I would call the primary sacrament. So I think that's a very important place to go. And I have stories to tell about these teenagers, inner city teenagers. And like I know one day in class, I mentioned, and I was not the only teacher, most of the teachers were people of color, but I spoke up at one point. And somehow I talked about how we all come from Africa. Even we white people, we come from Africa too. And this 14-year-old kid pops out and said, and I said, so Adam and Eve were Black. Africa is our mother, literally. And this kid says, did you just say that Adam and Eve were Black? I said, yeah, that's a scientific fact. He said, no, never told me that before. He was just in a daze, But I mean, that was one sentence that just happened to come out of my mouth, that we all come from Africa. So, to invite these kids into a bigger world and a truer world than they've been receiving stories about. And it really moves them. I mean, and these kids have so much imagination. This one group, there were like 4 or 5 kids, 14 and 15, who were gay boys. And they made their movie this way. They decided they'd go through the streets of Oakland with a camera and microphone and go up to strangers and say, we're gay, what do you think of that? And what a crazy thing to do, what a wild thing to do. And what happened is they got so much inner strength from doing that. And of course, it was fun, it was funny, it was laughable, but it also made them much stronger. When they left the class 3 months later, they were just more into their authentic identity. And that was just one example of their capacity to interact with magic and imagination in the world, and how much of our schooling invites that to happen, This one kid was into muscle cars, and he was a freshman, 14. So he did a movie on converting a muscle car, because one of our values they had to include was ecology. And so he did a movie on converting a muscle car gasoline engine to a vegetable engine, a vegetarian muscle car. And he had an uncle who worked as a mechanic, so his uncle helped him. But they filmed the whole thing, and at the end they had a race between this vegetarian muscle car and the gasoline muscle car, and you can guess which one won. I mean, it was a tremendous piece of work by a 14-year-old freshman, and he told me 10 years later, that it was by far away the most powerful experience in school he had ever had, that one experience. So again, to invite the young to do their birthing, that's how you bring the kingdom about. And everyone profits from it, because everyone can enjoy it. You enjoy their being so alive, you enjoy the humor that comes out, and that's a good side of good work.
Thanks for sharing, Matthew.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Robert.
Yeah.
Awesome. Oh, I was, Matt, this brings up a question that I wanted to make sure got into our circle. It was around how you've worked to stay so energized and in awe and resilient. And I know that as you've shared some of those stories with me in the times when you've struggled, it's been a source of wisdom and resilience for me as well. So I wonder if you might want to talk about, how you got yourself to re-engage after big setbacks and burnouts. And do you have any favorite strategies for refilling your inner bucket? Might share some of that.
One lesson I learned years ago was from Rabbi Heschel. And, he marched with King at Selma and so forth. And he took a lot of flack from the Jewish community, from his own community, because they would say to him, you know, there's enough anti-Semitism. You don't have to go south and stir up more and all that. But what he said was that he never spent time responding to his critics, that he got a lot of criticism, and he just, you know, life is too short. You have to, if you have a vision, you have to keep going forward. And so I learned something from that. You know, there's only so much time in a day, and there's only 70 days in a week, and there's so much energy to go around. So you don't want to feed a lot of the criticism you get. I think you should presume you're going to get criticism. If you're doing something useful, you're going to get criticism. You're going to step on people's toes. And, you know, try to do it with fairness and dignity and all the rest, and not rob others of their dignity, but also keep going. And one area to tap into is your moral outrage, the third chakra, anger. Don't underestimate it. Thomas Aquinas says nothing great happens without anger, because anger is that energy, that fire that perseveres, that has you persevering when the times get rough. So that third chakra fire, where you feel kicked in the gut, that injustice that has brought you to this place, this is something to tap into. It is a source. Don't underestimate it. Of course, another source is the via positiva, the beauty and the joy that draws you to your work. And of course, another is the people who you interact with. And for my part, like at our school, I was able to gather these wonderful faculty people, and they were also interesting and alive and different from each other. I mean, we had, I remember one day when we were doing a sweat lodge on campus at Holy Names College, and I was with a fellow who's Jewish and taught a course on nature walking in nature. He was a naturalist. And we were stripping down to go into the sweat lodge. He said, I must be the only Jew on the Catholic campus stripping down to go into a sweat lodge with my students and fellow faculty. I said, yeah, I think you probably are. I said, you could bet on that. But the diversity, we had physicists and witches, and of course the witch blew the roof off the Vatican. Every time the Vatican wrote a letter about me to the provincial, the last line would be, and he has a witch, Starhawk, on his faculty. So I told Starhawk, I said, you're really on the Vatican's radar. I said, you keep them up at night. And she said, I don't know why they're threatened by us. We didn't burn any of them at the stake. There's a pretty accurate answer there. You learn these things when you hang out in a diverse context, you know. So again, I just favor diversity, and that keeps you alive, and it keeps you at an edge, and it keeps all of us on our toes to interact with each other and to hear one another's stories, and to learn how we offend one another, even when we don't want to or don't intend to, and so on. I mean, the human race is amazing. It's kind of crazy, but wonderfully so if we can tame that reptilian brain. So I try to practice what I preach, or to walk my talk. You know, that there are these four paths, and all of them are avenues to the source. And so to practice silence and to learn to grieve. And of course, grieving has been a big part of our cosmic masses, and amazing things happen. I'll just tell you one story. When we did a mass for 1,000 people with Sounds True, their annual retreat up in the mountains there near Boulder. And it was a very diverse crowd. There were Jewish rabbis there, and there were Buddhists, and because I asked before we began kind of what was represented, and there were atheists. And afterwards, a woman comes up to me and she said, I'm an atheist. I'm a fierce atheist. I'm such a fierce atheist that when I'm walking down the street and there's a church, I cross the street to go by the church. And I said, yeah, that's pretty fierce, all right. And she said, but something happened to me when we did that grieving thing. And of course, I had everyone get down on all sixes and so forth and do the grieving, sounding from the third chakra. And then she pointed to her chest. She touched her chest and said, something happened, something shifted inside of me. And then she said, by the time communion came along, I had to have some. I was hungry for it. She said, these 2 hours have changed my life. And so again, don't underestimate the power of ritual, and don't underestimate the practices within each of those 4 paths. The practice of grieving, and the practice of silence in the via negativa, and the practice of joy and of beauty and of gratitude in the via positiva, and of course the practice of creativity and art in the creativa. So I try to do those things in my own fashion, and I try to marry work and prayer. For me, the shortcut to living a full life is to make your work your prayer. And by prayer, of course, I define that in my first book, Coming Musical Spirit. I mean a radical response to life. If you can integrate that into your work, then you're not, what should I say, spending a lot of time having to hold yourself up. If you can find in your work, and that's a very great blessing, it's not always possible. But given the kind of work I've been about, I've been blessed to have that opportunity. And so I find reading and studying and then writing and teaching that there's an integration there of my own needs and my own returning to the source and my gathering of others. But again, the community experience where we created a community in the schools that I taught in, that was a tremendous uplift too. And of course, being away from that is harder, but Zoom and the experience I've had with coronavirus, this is a wonderful plan B to meet new people from around the world. We have Peruvian here and Australian and God knows what all. That's neat too, that we're here to support one another and ask questions and birth answers together.
Oh, Matt, thank you so much. Oh, my heart is full. I know other people have questions as well. I don't want to hog the question asking. Who else would like to introduce themselves and either have a question or a comment? Oh, good, Judy. I was hoping you would share. You are on mute, my dear. There we go.
Thank you, Deidre. I was saying this class has been so wonderful, and the series, Creation Spirituality before this, Matt, I'm just so happy to be listening to you. I listen to you every day, though, because I'm listening to your meditations, which I love. And the truth
Thank
is
you.
that my work has been for the last 30 years. I'm retired now, just 2 years ago when I was 78. But my work had been as a director and practitioner in a grief counseling center. My work was with grief persons in grief. And just the privilege of hearing their stories was exactly what gave my life so much, in a strange kind of way, joy. You know, it's kind of a strange word to say when you're listening and being with people that are hurting, but I was too, you know, and it helped me so much to be able to tell my story to someone else and be healed and help to be healed. So I wanted to just say a couple things. One is that you talked about being older. I'm 80 years old, and I was in Nairobi for 5 weeks, just between Thanksgiving and Christmas this past year. And I was with my daughter and son-in-law. We went to this elephant orphanage, and this one of the handlers was so kind to me, and he was particularly respectful and tremendous of me. And the day before, the morning I left, he asked me how old I was, and I told him I was 80 years old. And he said that people in Nairobi don't often live that long. But he asked me if I would give him my blessing.
Hmm.
And I think the feeling of respect in that, and the feeling that I had was of just pure love for this person who was so kind to me,
Hmm.
but also the recognition that that's a kind of feeling that we all should have as older persons in here in our culture. Um, so I guess the one question I had is, one of the ways I got to being in these classes was Braiding Sweetgrass, which I don't know. Have you read Braiding Sweetgrass?
Mhm.
That book?
I've read the book, but I mean, I've read part of the book, but haven't finished it yet. But I have a lot of respect for it. I like it a lot. A lot of people I know have gotten a lot from it.
It brought me to this. It brought me to this. It brought me from there to your book, The Order of the Sacred Earth.
Hmm.
I began to realize how important it was for me to be involved in this sense of interconnectedness and this sacredness of the earth. And so, and then from there, heard that we were doing the creation spirituality thing. And so that was what I did. But I have a question for you, and that is, in terms of the Order of the Sacred Earth, that's one of the places that I thought maybe would be this place of my heart to work with others to help to heal the earth, help to have. I think we need to grieve the losses that we've, you know, just have in our environment and our. But anyhow, is the Order of Sacred Earth? Are you going ahead with that? Are you moving forward? Is it an order? Is it a movement? What's going on with that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for that beautiful story about the Nairobi fellow who asked for your blessing. Can I ask how old was he?
You know, he was in his 60s.
In his 60s. Oh, yeah.
But he was yeah, he seemed much younger than that, but he said he was 60.
Well, you seem much younger than 80 too. So, but anyway, that's just a beautiful story. And I think it manifests the respect that so many, what should I say, older cultures have
Yeah.
for elders. But oh yeah, you asked about the Order of Sacred Earth. Yes, well, we meet the last Tuesday of every month. We meet online by Zoom, and so you can look into that and join. Usually between, I don't know, 20 and 35 people meet. And from all over the world. There's people in Peru and Australia and Canada and UK and France and so forth. Yeah, I think we have a number of what we call pods, which are the communities. I remember the last number I heard, maybe it was 65 or something like that, different pods, groups of people. And that's why we meet every month to kind of share stories about what different groups are doing. And I mean, there are a lot more people than just those who show up on the Zoom meeting.
Right.
So anyway, you're welcome to join. And there is a newsletter. So just look up Order of the Sacred Earth. There's a newsletter that is being kept up pretty well. And one of the people now who are in leadership is a woman who is an Indigenous woman from Okinawa. And there, it was interesting to hear her talk. She talked a little of her story last time. And it was so parallel to Native American story and Native Canadian stories, but with what they've suffered under the Japanese. When I think Okinawa, I think, well, Japanese, but no, there's an indigenous population there that's very large actually, but they've suffered the same kind of abuse that indigenous people suffered at the hands of Western invaders in the Americas. So it's a universal practice. Sorry, laugh about it, but I don't know what better word that is for it, is a habit, I guess, of humanity to want to exclude those who were different from us, or whose land we're trying to steal. So I guess the Japanese did to them what the Europeans did to the indigenous people here. But in some way, I found it somewhat, what would be the word? I don't know what the right word for that is. Something positive insofar as we're dealing with human nature here, not just with cultural differences. And so it could be a revelation, again, about taming that reptilian brain that makes it into our cultural priorities, our cultural value systems, and you know, and learn that we're one species, we're one family, and with diversity. And let's look for the wisdom, not for the, you know, the differences. And so anyway, that's one of the lessons I learned very recently from the Order of the Sacred Earth, because she spoke up about her, because she'd become more and more interested now in her language, and her, which is not Japanese, and her cultural ways and so forth. And of course, the wars, certainly the Second World War, did tremendous damage to their people. But it's coming back, but they too, these First Nations around the world, are beginning to wake up to their dignity and the wisdom they have to give the dominant world today, because they have lived in relationship with the earth in more circumspect ways, sustainable ways, for centuries, far longer than any of the dominating empires of the, you know, of our time.
Feeling called to do some work within Indigenous people in the area that I live in.
Where is that?
It's in Madison, Wisconsin.
Oh,
Kind
I've heard of it.
Doesn't
right
have
below.
to be there. Yeah, that's anyhow. And just the sort of the healing of the soul wounds. I think you're the one that called that the
Oh, yes.
soul wounds of the indigenous people. And I think just like hearing their stories and telling their stories with integrity and stories about their life, but also the stories about, you know, how they were removed from the land and the broken promises and, you know,
Exactly.
all that.
Exactly. No,
So,
that's where the healing really begins, is the telling of the stories. And
for sure.
we have to ask them for their stories. You know, we did a workshop for a week in Australia a number of years ago, and I told the people, local people organizers, said, now be sure to hire some Aboriginal teachers. And they said, really? I said, definitely. So they did, and this fellow named Eddie Kneebone taught for a week, and a friend of his, a woman friend of his. And at the end of the week, the whole faculty got up in front of the students, you know, to say goodbye and to say thank you, and each one had a little story to tell about the week. And when it came to Eddie, he stood up and he said, "This is the first time in my life that I've been invited to teach white people." And he cried. He broke down and cried. And I was so struck by that, because it's such a simple thing to ask someone to teach you something. You know, I mean, it doesn't cost any money. Well, we want to pay a stipend maybe, but the point is, why was this the first time in his life? He was in his 40s then. He was a civil rights activist in Australia. And I you know, he had a degree in some area, I don't remember what, but he was amazing. And I learned so much from him. You became friends. And then I invited him to come to Oakland to teach at our program at Holy Names College. And he said, well, he came with 2 big satchels. One of them was filled with boomerangs, filled with them. It was about 50 boomerangs. And I, you know, to me, in my naive way, I thought if you've seen one boomerang, you've seen them all, but it's not that. He pulled one boomerang out of his bag and he said, "This boomerang is for killing a duck when it's flying into the lake." And this boomerang is for killing a duck when it's flying out of the lake. And this boomerang is for tripping a kangaroo. Kangaroos have no knees, so you trip it with the boomerang and then you can stab it. I mean, I had no idea the sophistication, and I couldn't tell the difference between the boomerangs, but they had, they're like an airplane wing. They have, a different angle on it. But it just blew my mind away that all boomerangs aren't the same, and that the intelligence of these ancient people who survived because they applied their intelligence to the angle in which you file down a boomerang. It was stunning. And his other big bag was full of paintings, Australian indigenous paintings. And he said, in our culture, they were all rolled up, of course. He said, we don't put paintings on the wall. We put them on the floor. And everyone sits around the painting. And then everyone goes on and talks about it. And everyone has a different angle on the painting. So, it's a real lively conversation about the meaning of the painting. It's like the blind man and the elephant story, that everyone's in a different place, or you got something different to say about it. So anyway, those were some of the lessons I learned. I think many lessons. One night, it was Starry Night. We were out there and he said, well, in our tradition, we don't tell our children how many millions of miles of stars are away. We tell our children that the near stars up there are our recent ancestors, and it's the stars are the campfires of those ancestors, and the distant stars are distant ancestors. But what they're doing is they're looking down at Earth for our fires, for our campfires, and wondering what's cooking and how things are going down here on Earth with us. So that taught me something really important, that cosmology, notice how they personalize cosmology, that stars aren't just objects that we can count and the distances from, that they're personalized. These are ancestors asking what's cooking on Earth. So those are just a few lessons I learned from Eddie. And there's so much to learn by asking people who are different from us, what's your wisdom about, and that should be a regular practice. So that's one approach to Native American people, is to invite them to teach. If you're in a church, have them come and lecture. Doesn't mean they have to preach from the pulpit. That's pretty uncomfortable for anybody, but that they come and teach about their worldview and their religions and so forth, and what Christianity has done to them. We have to understand that often churches, not always, but often, they sent their problem clergy to be with the indigenous people. Clergy who might have drinking problems or drug problems or sexual issues. The Native people did not always get the cream of the crop. Sometimes they did, but not always. I know for sure. So the distortion of Christianity and the face of Christianity, and of course these schools, often the name of religious schools, those are horrible things that went on. And it's so important to get, as you're saying, getting the story out, getting the truth out. It's so hard to heal without that.
Yeah. Oh, so powerful. Thank you, Matt. I'm noticing we've got about 20 minutes left. I wanted to make sure, hopefully you get to meet everyone. I didn't know if, and thank you, Judy. I'm excited to hear about the next chapter with this work. It's really exciting. But I want to make sure if Brad and Brittany and Roxanne, if you might want to, Brad.
Yeah, well, one of the things I was thinking about was, I think it was in your book. It was a Meister Eckhart quote. I think it was, all day God spends giving birth. I think that was the quote. And it just reminded me of how generative everything is. I wasn't really focusing on the birth part, but more about that everything is kind of alive and things. And the other thing that I kind of was thinking about is how much all the things that kind of make life meaningful, poetry, art, music, rap, grief, everything is in the right hemisphere. And yet our society is so left hemisphere oriented. And I'm a recovering lawyer, if that helps. I mean, I'm still doing the job, but that was so left brain hemisphere.
Yeah.
But on that note too, I was thinking about Jesus and the parables, and I was thinking in particular about the prodigal son and how that story is kind of reminding me, and I just wanted to get your take about that. Almost seems to me like a union of the hemispheres. So sort of like one hemisphere goes way out, and then the other, then they come back after. But I was just curious what your thoughts were about that. So.
I think that's a wonderfully creative interpretation of that story. I love it. But I couldn't agree more about the split of the hemispheres. And, Einstein said, I abhor, this is a quote, I abhor American education, unquote. And why? For the very reason you're talking about, because he says, we've been given two gifts, the rational brain and the intuitive brain. And the rational brain should serve the intuitive brain because the intuitive brain gives us values. He says values do not come from the rational brain. They come from the intuitive brain or deep feeling, which are the same things, said Einstein. Unfortunately, we live in a society, he said, where we honor the rational brain and we neglect the intuitive brain. So to me, that is the bottom line critique of education and academia and law schools and business schools and seminary schools and all of learning in the West. That and of course, that's patriarchy. Patriarchy is only at home with the rational. And that's what Otto Rank was critiquing, that we have to bring in play. We have to, and how you began, we have to bring in art and music and dance and all this, that's equally important. You don't have to throw out the rational brain, but you got to put it in context. And again, to me, that's the difference between knowledge, which is rational, and power, it's raw power, versus wisdom. And I'll tell you a story about wisdom. Some of you may have heard it, but it's a good story, good hearing twice. Years ago, I lived in Chicago, so it was, well, over 40 years ago. I got an invitation to give 4 lectures at the University of Vancouver. And they said, you can pick 3 topics, whatever you want. But the first one has to be on wisdom in the university. Wisdom in the university today. And I sweated over that talk. I didn't have a talk, and I flew to Vancouver. I remember it was raining, and I had a talk at 1:30 in the afternoon or so. And I didn't have a talk. So I took a hot bath and said, maybe I'll get an idea in the hot bath. And sure enough, I got a message, tell the truth. Oh, that's that's an idea. So I got up, and everyone was about 400 people, faculty, staff, students, and everyone was laid back because they just had lunch, 1:30 in the afternoon. And so my opening line was talking about wisdom. I've been told I must talk about wisdom in the university. I said, talking about wisdom in university today is a bit like talking about chastity in a brothel. And with that, there was this tide, I'll never forget it, this tide of bodies that rose and got out of their slumber just like that. So I spent the next hour talking about where did wisdom go? Because when university was invented in the late 12th century, it meant a place to find your place in the universe. It was about cosmology, really. And the feminine, divine feminine, was absolutely explicit that wisdom was the goddess that ruled over the arts and the sciences. That's how university began in the West. But modern era banished the feminine, therefore wisdom, and now university is a place to find your job in a man-made work world. And people are trying to change that because of environment and stuff, and we're tinkering at the edges. But again, that was a stark example of what you're talking about. But I love you're taking the parable of Jesus, because that's rational, isn't it? That you should get, and many of Jesus' parables were like that. He was tweaking the rational, like this one that is really disturbing, where he says that, these people are working all day and then this guy comes late and he gets the same pay as the others. That's not accounting. That's not good accounting. And of course, your example is a good one too, that his brother was working away in the fields and the fellow of the story, the prodigal son, he went out and had parties and became a hippie or something and all this, and he comes back and he expects to be treated equally, and his brother didn't like that. But again, I think Jesus is trying to shake us up, just like you say, about bringing in this other element of human capacity, our capacity for, well, for fun and play and forgiveness and the irrational. Again, that's what Otto Rank is saying. He's saying that Western civilization imagines itself to be rational, and it's killing the planet. I mean, he didn't talk much about the planet. This is in the 30s. People weren't that much in the environment, but he's saying it's killing our souls. Too much rationality kills the soul. And it's from rationality that we go to war, because we always prove that the other side is wrong. And yet war is very irrational. It's killing in order to what? To live. He says we have this thing about, he says it's insane to say we're going to go to war to prevent war. And he said it's insane to say you're going to heal democracy with more democracy. And I think that's a really interesting statement, especially given where we are today regarding democracies around the world. So anyway, food for thought. And I like your idea about it gives me a whole new take on the gospel stories there. But I think it is like that. And when Jesus says you have to become like a child, well, the child is not overly rational. The child is in tune with his or her intuition and spontaneity and playfulness and what Ronk would call the irrational.
So powerful.
And art.
And art.
Mhm.
Oh, Matt, thank you. Thanks, Brad. That's, yeah, we'll be chewing on that for a while. Oh, this is great. Brittany.
I can ask a question. I guess my job is I work in mental health counseling. So I'm working through burnout from that failed system that we have, which is, I think, like, I guess the way I conceptualize like mental health is like, we kind of have to deal with all the stuff that like society's not dealing with. We have to try to like pick up the pieces with like the limited resources of just what we can do one-on-one in a room with someone, which is very limited when so many of the issues are systemic. But one of the things, I guess, I really want to change what I'm doing. I'm sorry, my dog is barking in the back. I was curious, like, it seems like for most, like in the what I've read of your work, that you really pushed against institutions, and sometimes that led to like falling out or having to leave or criticisms. And I guess just as a younger person, like coming up against that and dealing with like a lot of fear about like what that process is like, I just wondered if you had any advice of like carrying the truth to these like to power or to these oppressive institutions, like, because it can feel like really overwhelming for me personally, and sometimes that fear holds me back, but I have the strong passion to say the truth and fight for what I believe in.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for that work you're doing. That is really important and difficult work, but also to caution you, you know, that you do have to take care of yourself. And if you're feeling exhausted, if you're feeling burned out, that's real. You know, Meister Eckhart says compassion begins at home with one's own body and one's own soul. And I just think you have to really pay attention to that, you know, that if you need time off, or if you need to make a change in your calling there, that's not the end of the world. It's a way to keep you alive and well so you can serve in other ways, because obviously you're providing such an important service there. One of our faculty members was Sister Jose Habde. She was a Seneca woman, raised on a reservation in Colorado, and also a Franciscan sister. And she was once invited by a big nursing group to give a keynote at their conference. And she said yes. It was beyond burning out. And then kind of the head lady, who was very rational, kind of a nurse ratchet, she told her exactly what she should say and what she shouldn't say. She gave all these orders. Well, Jose was not someone who took orders from others anyway. But so she got up and her opening line was, it's better to burn out than never to have burned at all, which is the exact opposite of what Nurse Ratched wanted to hear. And then she went on from there, you know. And so that's right. You know, we want to honor those who have been generous, maybe even overly generous in difficult circumstances like you're naming, and which you named very profoundly and truthfully, the state that our mental health professions are in today. And but that just came up for me when I heard you talk about burning out in those circumstances. So that's to praise what you've already accomplished. But, you know, it's like Jesus said, if you go into a house and you say peace on this house and you don't get peace back, then you leave. And it says, shake the dust from your feet. Now, that especially, I was thinking about that today, because that's been part of my life story, that I've had to shake some dust from my feet. But, you know, in Palestine, where he lived, of course, things were very sandy. There's a lot of desert around. So shaking dust from your feet is very practical, but it's also a way of saying, hey, I'm moving on. And that's exactly what he said to do. He said, move on. If you're not receiving as much reward, and by that, he doesn't mean a paycheck, but if you're not getting peace back when you're offering peace, you know, that there's other places that will take you. And that's been my experience. I was very naive. And I think naivete sometimes is a virtue that is sometimes very helpful. I'm kind of glad I was naive. But being 81, I want to kind of warn young people like yourself, don't be naive. That you are up against forces, these structures, these institutions that don't always have a good heart and a good value system. And they get run down. They run out of the energy that was originally there in the nobility of their vocation to serve others. And you may choose to stay and to critique and to fight that kind of battle. But to do that, you've got to take good care of yourself because it's very enervating. They're holding a lot of cards. Or you may just say, well, you know, I've done my best and I've learned a lot, including how decrepit this profession is in its current state. And, you know, to save my own soul, if you will, so I can serve others and live a decent life to do so, you know, I think I'll shake the dust from my feet and move on. I do think that when you're doing good work, you're going to be disturbing people. And sometimes it's people with power and big egos, and you want to kind of brace yourself. So, but you know, Dr. King was asked one day, how can you march in the suburbs of Chicago in Skokie, knowing that people want to kill you? And he said, well, you have to love something more than the fear of death if you're going to live. Love something more than the fear of death. That's a beautiful, powerful teaching. And, you know, Gandhi once said that if you're going to lead, prepare yourself for mountains of suffering. Mountains of suffering. That it's not a picnic. But you know, I'm sure you know a lot already as a provider with people with mental handicaps, and there there are many ways where you could serve. You know, maybe not at a big institution, maybe it's too much, but there's so many ways that are more in other circumstances. You know, like I know that one of my brothers has Alzheimer's now, and he's in they found a better place for him than he was in before. And this place is actually in a home, and, you know, it's fewer people. There's more humanity there. They even gave him a dog when he moved in. He's responsible for the dog in the house. And, you know, it's just more personable. It's more real. And the other place he was in he was alone 24 hours a day. And, you know, it just wasn't a healthy place for him. So, you know, there are people trying to reinvent your profession today, and you want to kind of find out where they are and who they are, and if it feels good to you, and make allies with them, you know. So you don't have to be married to the particular expression of your profession that you're currently in if that's not working for you. So, and you know, where you are, where you can create your own vision of what's possible. And a smaller entity is usually going to be more flexible like that, and find like-minded people, because you're not alone in wanting to critique this profession today. We had a student once who had her advanced degree in your profession, and she went back to Washington, and she took my advice about infiltrating seriously. And she was in some big, I remember I visited her, she was in this big building, you know, national headquarters of mental health or something, but she was in there trying to change things from the inside. They were, you know, the bureaucrats who were running these things. They weren't actually doing it face to face with the clients. But she lasted several years, and through a couple of different administrations, until finally, I think it was too much. The politicians had their hands in it too heavily. But she spent many years, you know, doing some decent work and trying to reinvent it. And she brought the four paths. She brought spirituality into the process without, of course, calling it that. So, so you know, you have a big future ahead of you, but don't let yourself get worn down. That's the big thing. Don't, you know, burning out is a sign. It's not a disease, but it's a sign that, hey, you've got to heed what Eckhart says. Compassion begins at home, with your own body, your own soul, your own time, and honor that.
Oh, thank you, Matt. I'm so valuing how you're holding the both end of this, calling us to great work and to great self-care all at the exact same time. We've been talking about self-care and collective care, and how to think of this from a both personal but also systemic way. So such riches, so good. We have just 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure that everyone was able to speak if they so chose. I don't know. I'm watching. There you go, Roxanne. There
Hi
you go.
there. Hi, Matthew.
Hi there.
I lead interfaith, interspiritual services in a little tiny church in the middle of a neighborhood, and it just might be nice for people to know that these things go on, that the neighborhood was so identified with being good neighbors that they all decided that they wanted to pray together. So they invited me to come lead services in an interfaith, interspiritual way, so that the whole neighborhood could pray together and be comfortable doing that. And they were given this little church that was right smack in the middle of the neighborhood that had been owned by the Baptist Convention, and owned by the now renegade DC Baptist Convention. They got thrown out of the Southern Baptists, and they're very kind to us, and they come and visit us, and they say, you know, oh, we love what you do, because they only required us to do something spiritual in the building. That was what they asked for. And I often find myself in the position of being a Jewish person, helping wounded Christians connect to Rabbi Jesus and to Celtic Christianity. And of course, your work helps me do that very much, and I really, really appreciate that. It's just a funny little place that I have landed in.
That's a really interesting story. And it's in Washington, D.C.?
Yes, it's in Bethesda, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C.
Wonderful. And that's interesting that you're Jewish. Are you a rabbi?
No, no, I was trained like in a very traditional way to be a cantor by somebody saying, "Oh, you sing good. Why don't you learn how to do all this?" I didn't go to school for it. The cantor trained me. So sometimes they call me Cantor Roxanne, but most of the time it's just Roxanne.
But you're dealing with healing wounded Christians. Well, that's
Yeah, they really get very skittish. They get really afraid of coming to services, and I put some online so that they could quietly see what I do and not be afraid of me, and and hopeful, and so little by little, I get people to understand that I'm not trying to make them be anything, convert them to anything, just humanity.
Well, that's wonderful. And you carry the ancestral lineage of Jesus, so that's not to be underestimated. And I remember I did a weekend ecumenical event in the synagogue in Ashland, Oregon. It was a few years ago, and they invited several traditions. They had Native American there and Protestant and so forth. And I was asked to give a few talks, but the last day, Sunday, this cantor stood up from the synagogue, and he had taken some of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudate Si on the environment and translated it into Hebrew, and then sang it in in a certain modality of
Probably as a Torah chant. Probably.
Yeah, as a special chant. And
chant.
I was just blown away. I said, surely this is the first time in 2,000 years that there's been a papal encyclical sung in a synagogue in Hebrew to this very special chant. But that was kind of the hype. And it was a synagogue run, by the way, by a wonderful Jewish rabbi. I have his book right here. David Zaslow. Maybe you know it, Jesus' first century rabbi. But he was the head of this particular synagogue. But I think it's one of the most exciting things in our time that's happening. I mean, there are many exciting movements, women's movement and deep ecumenism and all the rest. But this isn't talked about much. And that is with the apologies from the Christians, certainly with the Second Vatican Council and so forth, a lot of Jews have kind of chilled out a little about Jesus. And a lot of Jewish rabbis are writing books about Jesus now. I have several of them. And it's so exciting because, of course, their insight about Jesus is so much, what can I say, more profound, I think, than many Christian versions of the man. And I just think it's an untold story. This is just one of those wonderful books, but there are many. There's another one here by Green, Rabbi Green.
Green, yeah.
Well, this is one of his books, Judaism for the world. But he's very much into creation spirituality. But the point is that there are these interpretations now of Rabbi Jesus that are coming from really solid Jewish sources. And I think it's a phenomenon, really, and important. It's important for Christians. It's interesting that you find yourself nursing wounded Christians, but it's also important for others. And I think it's a further stage in deep ecumenism or interfaith. So I'm very excited about your story there, and thanks for sharing it. And blessings on your work.
Oh, yeah, you got to meet everyone. That makes me so happy.
Interesting and motley group of people. I must
look who comes to your parties, Matt.
Like a party, yeah. Like a faculty meeting.
Yeah, it is pretty much like a faculty meeting. I know. It's such a joy to get you all to get to know each other a little bit better and to have time with you, Matt, and just know how your work is going. It just brings me such joy for you to have a sense of some of the paths that are being followed with the 4 paths as part of the work. So what you didn't get to hear about is Patricia is in Peru bringing forward the School of the Swans, and she is helping us all to know that we are not ugly ducklings, but multicolored swans, and not only in Peru and the US and Spain and Germany. And so it's just one of the many things that this incredible group is doing.
Great.
Yeah. So I want to extend huge gratitude to you for spending these 2 hours with us, which of course flew by. I knew they would. And you're always welcome to come back next week if you want. You're deeply part of this community. Next week is our last class, and we're going to put all of the pieces together as we're reinventing work, moving into the Via Transformativa, thinking about what are the actions that we want to take, commitments we want to make to ourselves and one another as we move out into the world. And just so that you know, Matt, as Roxanne put in the chat, each person has created their own personal vision statement of what the world that they're envisioning, and thinking about how they want to play within that vision, thinking about goals that they that flow out of that vision, and putting it into concrete actions. So that is the path that we've been on, and we've been following the 4 paths to do it. So thank you. And we're giving, and I taught everyone that this is from a friend, Gail Straub. She says we give twinkles, sparkles. So you were all sending our blessings to you. Oh, thank you, Mel, for remembering that.
Thank you.
Thank you, dear ones, so much. Any burning things, or we will see you all next week. With the grace of the divine, take care. Thank you all so much. Mwah.
Thank you, Deidre. Thank you, Matthew. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Oh, Matt, thanks so much. It was amazing. So good to see you.
Great.
Never. Bye, you all. Take good
Bye.
care. Bye.